First and foremost, a big thank you for joining us and a good morning to all of you. For those of you who don't know me, and I've noticed a few names of people who probably do, I'm Dale Swords. I'm co-founder of Understanding Solutions. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Stuart Juggins from Ardent, who I'll be handing over to you shortly to talk through things. The format of today, just to be clear, is for Stuart, who is the expert within this field, to run through a brief presentation, during which we'll be taking questions in the chat. So as we go, please do add any questions that you have to the chat, and we'll address as many of those questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Please do make it as interactive as you can, and we will come back to those questions towards the end of the presentation. Also, the purpose, as we described in the invitation, is to provide a bit of a recap on IR35 and to look at the opportunities it's going to be creating in the future, as well as the obvious challenges too. I'm also really pleased to take the opportunity to announce that we have created this specific division, Understanding Solutions, to help address many of the issues that we'll be discussing today, and which will be officially launching to the market in a couple of months' time. So without further ado, I will hand over to Stuart, co-founder of Ardent, and I'll let him explain in more detail what he does and what all of this means to you. Over to you, Stuart.
Great, thanks Dale. So good morning, everybody. As Dale mentioned, my name is Stuart Juggins, and I'm the founder of an organisation called Ardent. And just briefly, just to set the scene, just so you understand my background and why we're talking today. So what does Ardent do? Well, Ardent is a consultancy who specialises in only really three things, which is building and creating consultancy solutions organisations, predominantly within recruitment, advising on how projects and services should be scoped and delivered and managed, and obviously, or a lot of what we do is around IR35 and how that should be steered and shaped. A lot of what I do is in the public sector and has been for the past 3-4 years. Formerly, before I founded Arden in 2018, I was the head of solutions for Adecco Group. Previous to that, I had founded project solutions for Experis. But my background really is technology and management consulting. So I've been in and around the professional services, project solutions consulting world for well over 25 years. So certainly since IR35 came into effect back in 2000, I've been dealing with it as a contractor, as a consultant, as a business leader. And as Dale mentioned, the purpose of today really is just to recap on a couple of things around IR35, but actually, rather than looking at some of the doom and gloom that people are looking at, we, as a provider, and the organisations that we work with, such as Understanding Solutions, see this as a real opportunity. And what we want to try and talk about really is the opportunities that we see IR35 is driving and has driven through the past 3-4 years in public sector, certainly. And some of those drivers are things like COVID and the pandemic. You know, there are some benefits of the pandemic, which we'll talk about slightly. As Dale mentioned, what we're going to end up with is a Q&A session towards the end of at the end of the deck. This will only take about 20-25 minutes to go through. So send those questions through to Dale and we'll address those at the end. We do want a very open dialogue session. But what I'll do is I'll start now. I apologise if I pause just to have a little cough, but I'll come back. So where are we? Well, just to recap on IR35, a lot of you have probably heard of this. Again, I don't know if you're a end hiring or a business provider or if you're a contractor yourself. But IR35 is not new. It's been around for a long time. It is certainly came into effect in, sorry, I'm just moving my video. It came into effect in 1999, hence the name of IR35 was due to the press release in 1999. It actually came into effect in 2000. And IR35 was designed to try and stop this leave on Friday, start on Monday approach that a lot of employees were taking at the time. They were mainly around IT and tech, leaving on a Friday, coming back into the same organisation, albeit as a contractor, and of course getting the benefits of that, mainly taxation paid through dividends and the likes, things that you've probably heard of. Now, IR35 is predominantly aimed at the contracting community, limited company contractors, or PSCs, as we may refer to them as we go through this deck. And ultimately, IR35 is split into two sort of parts. There is the inside and there is the outside community. we're going to go into a bit of detail around what is inside and what is outside, but in essence, inside is very straightforward. You are simply a PAYE employee, albeit you're not on a full-term contract. And outside, well, outside can be a bit more complex to define, and we'll talk about that. But ultimately, you are a provider of a service, or you're an independent contractor. Therefore, you have the freedom to operate as you see fit. And that in itself is part of the issue. There's a lot of ambiguity around what that means and how things like controls and measures come into effect. And what we'll talk about today, or we'll just bring to life very quickly, is some of those elements. So what's changed really with IR35? Well, there's been a lot of changes over the past 20 years. The most significant change really was in 2017. And at that time, HMRC made the decision that actually the determination of who is inside or who is outside should really fundamentally change. Up until that point, it was always the responsibility of the end contractor, the PSC, to make that determination. And what HMRC were finding was that determination was maybe not correct. It was not being executed properly. And so also trying to go and investigate the number of contractors that are in the UK, of which there are hundreds of thousands. Of course, the HMRC don't have enough resources to do that. So they wanted to shift the focus towards the end hiring organisation, the end client, as we would deem the hirer. And at that point, they made the decision that the hirer, who ultimately is deciding, is this a role? Am I requiring an individual or am I requiring a service? Should be determining if that role or that individual or that provider is inside or out. And then what would happen is they would pass that process down. They would go through something called a status determination, and they would pass that determination down to what is the fee payer. And the fee payer in this instance would be a recruitment agency. Understanding Recruitment or Understanding Solutions could be deemed as the intermediary, who are then liable for really capturing and making sure payments were correct. At the time in 2017, HMRC was still trying to figure a lot of these things out and did make a few mistakes. We'll talk about some of those mistakes. But in essence, they were shifting the responsibility of determination away from the contract. And that started causing some of the problems because there was a big misalignment of what the contractor thought they were providing and what the end hirer thought they were procuring. The other key point of interest in 2017, this has since changed, was the liability sat with the agency for incorrect determination at that time. Now that's since changed, but at the time it was obviously very unfair on the agency that they're not making the determination, yet they're liable if it was done incorrectly. So the process and everything we've talked about is officially called the off-payroll working in public sector. What's going to change? Well, as you've probably heard, in April 2021, it was meant to be April 2020. We're going to now roll this into the private sector. And what does that mean? Well, fundamentally, it's a huge change for the industry. And that means any organisation, or the majority of organisations, and I'll clarify this in a second, that uses a contractor or engages a contractor now needs to make this determination. And they need to make that determination based on how the individual, how the organisation will perform their services or perform their role. Now, there is something called small company exemption, which I'll touch on in a second, but a lot of organisations won't fall into that remit. Certainly, a lot of the big banks, would be well outside that, and they took knee-jerk reactions, which we'll talk about. The problem with all of this has been lack of education, lack of awareness. It has got better in the past year, but even when this was launched in 2017 and with the lead up into 2017, HMRC only gave organisations 6 months notice that this was coming. So there's a lot of misconfusion, misunderstanding of what could and should be done. And that drove a lot of fear and scaremongering into the industry. Now, what I want to talk about is the opportunity that IR35 creates, or rather the changes of IR35. So point to remember is IR35 is not new. It has been around for 21 years. It's not going away. You cannot get away from IR35, and anybody who tells you you can is misinformed. But what IR35 or the changes drive is a change in behaviour. And that's what we've started seeing, and that's what we want to talk about today, is that change in behaviour. Things like the evolution of the workforce, the gig and freelance economy, performance-based engagements. These are all good things, but they all need consideration. And that's what we're going to sort of introduce you to today. So I mentioned small company exemption. So HMRC have made this determination, or this rule rather, that if you are a small company and you meet 2 of the qualifying criteria, and the criteria are there for you to read: revenue less than 10.2 million, and or a balance sheet of less than 5 million, and or employees of less than 50, then you would be deemed a small company. And as such, because you are exempt, the determination for inside or outside falls back to the contractor. Now, key point of reference is up until 2017, there was no real test to go through. There are lots of tools that exist in the market, but up until that point, there was no real fundamental test. It was all based upon a contract and what was worded in the contract. So those standard rules still apply if you're a small company exempt. But what's happened now in the past 3-4 years is a lot of tools have come into the market which makes determination far more simplistic, far more easy to be accurate with. And we're going to talk about how we go through those determinations. So what are those key tests? Well, you may have heard of these. The key 3 tests was actually 4, but the key 3 ones are substitution, supervision, direction, control, mutuality of obligation, and finally one is financial impact and liability. And I'll go through those very quickly. So substitution is one that's quite frequently misunderstood. And what this is around the PSC, the contractor. No other party but the contractor has the right to control or determine substitution. What often happens is in that supply channel, the end hirer may restrict or reject substitution for obvious reasons. If it's in government, there may be security clearance requirements. There could be data privacy requirements, whatever it is. There's actually several levels of substitution, but the key point here is that the contractor is the one that can invoke substitution. No other party can. And by the way, this is not a you must pass all 4 tests to be outside. It's done on a weighted measurement. So just because we fail substitution does not mean we're immediately inside. We then look at the additional tests: supervision, direction, control. Well, what is that? Well, fundamentally, am I, as the end hiring organisation, telling you what to do, how to do it, and what order of work should be done, and how I want it to be reported? And if you're working on a task, I can tell you to change the order of tasks that you're working on. So in essence, treating you like an employee. If fundamentally that is how you're being treated, then the likelihood is that you are inside. Mutuality of obligation, well, specifically the absence of, is the agreement for a provider, the contractor, to continue providing their services if there is no work to do, and or the end hirer to continue paying for services if there is no work to be done. And I'm going to touch on why these are a little bit subjective and grey in a second. Now, if you're inside, the chances are there may be a mutuality of obligation. If you're outside, there should be no mutuality of obligation. What happened previously in the way that contracts were written is providers would look at writing key terms into the documents around substitution and things that substitution would be allowed. There would be no mutuality of obligation and things like that. We're going to talk about an actual better way of doing that in a second. The final one is financial impact and liability. And what does that mean? Well, if you're outside, HMRC is deeming you really to be a business and you're providing a business-to-business service. Therefore, should you really be duly bound and liable for the services that you're providing and the performance and the failure of, such that, for example, you're delivering a piece of software. If you fail to deliver it on time, should you pay for that or should the end client pay for that? Now, again, this is a very grey area. The key test really is, do you as a business, are you in control and do you suffer hardship if you don't deliver a substantial performance-driven service? Now, the one thing that overrides all of that is working practice. So a lot of what I do is going into organisations and assessing contracts, but actually assessing working practice. And HMRC have been clear on this, and there's not a lot of case law around this, unfortunately, probably because they keep losing. But in essence, there's 2 assessments. They will assess the contract and then they will assess the working practice. And it doesn't matter what contract you've got, what wording you've got. So you can go and run your contract through Kudos or any other provider, and it could say you're outside. But if fundamentally you're operating in an inside basis, that will override the contract. So you have to adhere to the contract that you're operating against. Now, as I mentioned, IR35 inside is, for all intents and purposes, you are an employee. You're operating as an employee, you're told and controlled and reported and seen and viewed as an employee. You're just not a full-time employee, you're not on the books, as it were, but you are seen as part and parcel of that organisation. You may appear on an organisational chart. You may go to a lot of staff meetings and those sorts of things. It's very simplistic to manage, obviously, because you're part and parcel of the business. You're paid as a PAYE, as an employee would be. That PAYE is controlled and managed by the agency still, so the agency still pays, or an umbrella would manage that. But that supervision control is done by the end client. You don't have the right to substitute because they're hiring you as an individual to perform the services or to perform that work. Outside, well, this is where it gets a little bit grayer. In essence, you are a service provider. We won't get into the semantics of what a service is, but you are a professional, you're an individual or an organization rather, that is providing your skills to deliver an outcome. That outcome could be anything. Could be building a piece of software. It could be designing a new widget. It could be building a house, for example. It comes down to the freedom to operate and deliver that service as you see fit. You are contracted to complete an activity. How you deliver that activity is up to you. You carry the financial burden, the liability for failure, should you not deliver that on time. And this is where they become more complex to really manage, because with that lack of apparent supervision, direction and control from an employee-employer relationship, we have to look at other mechanisms of managing control. And when I talk about control, I'm talking about control of performance, control of the tasks, direction of the tasks, not direction of the individual. You may have heard a lot of the industry, and there's a lot more movement and interest in things like statements of work. And why is that? Well, a statement of work is a performance-driven contract. It's a services-oriented agreement around which we define a set of deliverables and relevant payment conditions and liability and accountability. And that's why they're gathering momentum. Do you have to have an SOW? No, you don't. It just comes down to the working practice again. The beauty of being outside is that you have the tax flexibility that comes with operating a legitimate business. How you pay yourself is up to you. Most likely as a contractor, PSC, you will probably choose to operate through some dividend structure. You'd also get the benefits of things like the VAT scheme benefits, such as flat rate and the likes. The real key test here is that you are an organisation providing a service and being paid for the service, and you have the freedom to operate within the constraints of what your client needs. Of course, you can't just go rogue, and that's where a lot of the industry is trying to pivot things to. HMRC themselves, back in 2017, I think they released some industry stats at the time that even they view 2/3 of all workers or contractors would be outside IR35, or would continue to be outside IR35. So what are the challenges with IR35? Well, I've mentioned some of them. The biggest ones I saw when I first saw this coming into effect in the private sector mainly was knee-jerk reactions, blanket assessments, blanket determinations. A lot of our clients work with the big financial organizations, and we were seeing them just simply go, no, we're not going to use contractors. And you've got to go inside, or you've got to go perm. At the time, HMRC weren't very clear on this, but they are very, very clear now that blanket determinations are illegal. You have to do something called use reasonable care to assess roles and assess correctly. So you can't just say all contractors are inside. And equally, you can't say that two individuals providing similar work or similar services would both be inside. Just because one is inside doesn't mean the other one is. So it has to be done on a fair and proper basis. And that comes back to education, comes back to culture. The end organisation's culture of how they have previously used and engaged with contractors up until well, till now, basically, they could control those contractors as they see fit, because no liability, no tax liability sat with the end party. But from April 2021, it absolutely will. So of course, they're going to be far more defensive about how they do that. And we work with a lot of the large consultancies like Deloitte, PwC and EY, and as tax advisors, they are very risk averse. Their first approach is to manage the tax risk, not the delivery risk. And that's where a lot of conversations come here, is delivery risk. Well, just because I deem somebody inside, I may fix my tax problem, but I can't actually deliver the program of work now. So it's taking that right approach with careful consideration, based upon now and the future. HMRC created a tool, the Cest Tool. You may have heard of this, a check employment status for tax tool. It's really not great, if I'm honest. You may have heard that before. There are other tools in the market, which I won't mention. But what matters is reasonable care. And the definition of reasonable care is a bit subjective and it's a bit grey. But ultimately, reasonable care is having proper consideration of the whole process. What the individual is doing, what the organisation is doing, what the outcome needs to be, how it's going to be managed, and so on and so forth. And tools are created to try and help guide that process. The Cest one, being HMRC's, is a little bit woolly, especially on areas of mutuality of obligation, because they're harder to test for. And in fact, a lot of the work we were doing pre-April 2020, before this got pushed due to COVID, was going into organisations that had run Cest tests incorrectly, and even tests that I thought would have been inside, based upon just questions, not even assessing working practice, were coming up as outside on the Cest tool, which I fundamentally knew were not going to be outside. Hence, we've got this problem. And just as a point of reference, HMRC themselves dismiss Cest when it comes to things like investigations and going to tribunal. So that sort of gives you everything. So reasonable care is paramount. How do you do reasonable care? Well, you could use lawyers, you could use experts, you could use third-party organisations. It's about assessing the total contractual channel and the working practices. So what we've got to try and do is make the complex more simplistic. Well, how do we do that? Well, we've got to do that through knowledge, education, and process is obviously going to help. The market has gone through this misunderstanding and fear and scaremongering. It is getting much better. I've seen in the past 6 months, it is getting much, much better. There's a lot more good advice coming out now, whereas a couple of years ago, it was very, very misguided. One key point to remember, which you just want to draw back to, is IR35 borrows all of its legislation and its law from employment law, although it's a tax consideration. And that in itself is part of the problem, part of the challenge that we have, is that HMRC, when they created IR35, were looking at employment-based law. But if you're considering an outside worker, and worker is not the term we should be using really, but an outside engaged party, it's no longer an employer-employee relationship, it's a business-to-business provision. So employment law doesn't really lead itself to be very applicable. So it's all about education. Every time we go into organisations, and if you're a contractor or if you're an end hire, it's making yourselves aware of what needs to be done and what can be done. And that leads us into really the opportunities. So what are the opportunities? Well, the opportunities are pretty massive. A lot of the work we get pulled in to do is what we call workforce transformation or service transformation. Just because a role has been deemed inside does not mean that it has to be inside in the future. You can transform a lot of roles. There are certain roles that you just fundamentally can't. If you work on a board or you advise a board, for example, you are part and parcel of that organisation. You will never be outside. But a lot of other roles can be, even things like help desk agents, which are predominantly difficult to classify as outside because they are part and parcel of an organisation. They're controlled on how they do things. You could pivot that workforce to operate outside. It would be very difficult, but it could be done. The key thing here is looking towards the future and being open and aware of how do you want to drive activities? How do you want to drive tasks in the future? Just because you've engaged an individual, is that the right approach? Maybe moving forward. And we've certainly started seeing this the past 8, 9, 12 months. Since COVID came into real effect, We've seen a lot more remote working. I'm sure a lot of you are working remotely. And that is leading towards things that I mentioned, more gig economy driven, performance management driven opportunities and projects. So if I'm engaging with a contractor and that contract's working remotely and I can't touch and feel them like I would normally, well, how do I ensure they are delivering what I've required and what I've procured? And that's where we start getting into what's called outcomes-based services, or statements of work is the contract of choice. But it's really about an outcomes-based performance engagement, defining a task, defining what needs to be delivered, and holding somebody, the contractor and the end client, accountable to that process, and putting the proper process and rigor around that. So it's going to support those future working models. We're seeing that increase. The gig economy is picking up pace. We've seen that as well. And it ultimately allows us to continue to utilize the best skills. As you work and deliver services and you're a professional contractor providing professional services, well, then you should really be operating in a business to business fashion, and you should be carrying liability, and you should be open to those things. But with those liabilities, if you like, come the benefits, the freedom to operate, the ability to run multiple contracts, the ability to service your client as you see fit, the ability to substitute yourself out, if you like. So one of the key things I see a lot in a lot of contracts is named individuals that are outside. That's a big no-no. You're procuring the service from a limited company, not from an individual. And so then it leads to the ability for us to drive better efficiency and output. So if we're procuring that outcome, we're holding somebody accountable to that outcome. As a client, as an end client, it means I can focus on my core activity of running my business, not running an individual and running a team. And I'm going to pay that individual, that company, the contractor, to deliver against a set of outcomes that I have defined. And that's where we're really seeing the market pick up pace. And I've been doing this now for nearly 10 years in and around recruitment, and we've seen it gather momentum, and it is going to continue gathering momentum. A lot of industry analysts are now coming out with facts and figures around the future of working. And there are some stats that are being bandied around that in the next 5 years, 50 to 60% of all contracts deemed outside, we could say, will be driven through an SOW. Just to clarify very quickly, can you still operate through an SOW if you were inside? Absolutely, of course you could, but there would be no point, because the benefits and some of the additional oversight and governance that comes through an SOW would be wasted on an inside engagement, because it's part and parcel of the organisation. So just to clear that up. So that leads us on to client contractor engagement. Well, work with your supply channel, understand, think beyond the Cest tool. If you're using Cest, I would advise you don't. Look at, additional reasonable care, look at additional experts to support on that. Explore working practices, delve into culture. If you're predominantly a culture, of a hiring organization of controlling and managing contractors as individuals, perhaps start looking at ways that you could carve up or carve out projects and discrete pieces of work and procure those as a service. Explore options and appetite to drive better activity, reduce risk. You can outsource that risk. You can reduce costs through holding accountability. Discuss this with contractors and suppliers. In my experience, and we've spoken to thousands of contractors over the years, 80 to 90% of them obviously want to be outside. But when we explain to them being outside through a statement of work or a service-driven vehicle, it comes with additional benefits but some liabilities, and then they open to that, 80 to 90% of them are absolutely comfortable with operating in a true business-to-business basis. And then we get to that point of shared risk, shared reward. Pay for performance, don't pay for failure, and that leads to lots of additional benefits. So I've talked about outcome-based services. HMRC are very clear on this. Inside, you're basically an employee. Outside, you are a provider of services, or should be. It is my view, I think, and others share this in the industry, that in the coming years, there will be this very, very clear delineation between, if you're inside, that's very clear. If you're outside, you are only providing a service. You are not doing anything otherwise. The service is to provide that task and outcome, as I've mentioned. The contractor, the limited company, is able to deem that as fit. We utilise more appropriate contracts, things like master service agreements, statements of work, which I've mentioned, but service-driven contracts, which are then used to define, measure, track, and ensure that accountability throughout the whole supply channel. So one thing I want to be very clear here, this is not about pushing liability down. As an end client, an end procuring organisation, the hirer, as HMRC would call it, you are equally bound and liable in a services-based engagement. If you're not providing what your supplier, your contractor needs, then the liability is upon you to provide those things. Dependency failure is what we're talking about here. So this approach is not new. Some of you have probably been doing statements of work for many, many years. It is not a new concept. It's been around for well over 30, 40 years. It's used a lot in IT and tech. And when I was running professional services for the likes of HP, it's standard practice. And so where we're trying to move contracting to, and I think where the market is going to move to, is, well, contractors, PSCs, who are providing legitimate service, HMRC defines them as a legitimately contracted out service. They're all going to shift towards performance-driven engagements, and I think personally that's a good thing. So, understanding solutions. How do we help? Well, I've mentioned a lot of these things. Understanding solutions has been created, and I'm working with Dale and his team to really determine and put in place best process, best practice, and crucially, the line there says it all, which is what needs to be delivered, not what skills, people, teams are required. That's the first question, and that should be the only real question, is what do we need to deliver? What needs to be the success criteria? I have a project, I need to build a piece of software, I need to build a house. Not I need builders, I need developers. And that's where understanding solutions is coming in and is being created to do, is to really change that behaviour and provide some guidance and provide some coverage around how to do that, and then obviously execute if required. So it is a new division built to drive legitimate projects. This is not pseudo services or pseudo statements of work, which I see a lot in the industry, unfortunately. Statements of work are the contract of choice. Why? Well, because they are legitimate, they are robust when they're done properly. Just got to emphasize that point, when they are done properly. There is management and governance oversight, which are all good things. They should not be prohibitive. They should be beneficial, and it aids in the whole supply channel. Provides clients and contractors with more options, more flexibility, ability to drive success, scale in different ways, look at things like on-demand utilization, gig economy. There are organizations that we have advised in the past that have created very flexible resource models, service-driven models around things like building surveying, for example. All of this is delivered and managed with a level of service, what we call service management, across the top. And that's there to hold all the parties accountable, to hold the procuring party accountable, but also the supplying party accountable. And this model is not a new model, like I mentioned. It's been around for a long time, but this model has now passed scrutiny with the biggest tax advisors. So we go to a lot of big organizations, and I won't name them, but they're FTSE 100 organizations that implement these services, and they've all been scrutinized by those big 3-4 tax advisors to be legitimately contracted out service. So what does Understanding Solutions operate as? Well, effectively, it's that outsourced service provider. Now, the beauty of this, the benefit of this, is that whole determination position for IR35, if it is a legitimately contracted out service between the end hirer going into Understanding Solutions, or the determination responsibility flows down to Understanding Solutions to deem. As I mentioned at the start of this call, you cannot remove IR35, and anybody who tells you can is misinformed. It simply moves down the supply channel. But somebody at some point has to determine status and be accountable for the determination of that. Where it comes in with Understanding Solutions is, as a controlling service provider, they can deem the roles, the individuals, the contractors, inside or outside as needed. Could be a mixture of both. Could be permanent employees as well. It could be nearshore requirements, for example. The key thing here is the provision of a service. And that's everything we've talked about today. So IR35, it's not going away. It's been a bit of a thorn in our side. It probably will continue to be a bit of a thorn in our side, I think, until people are more informed. But it does create massive opportunity for organisations that operate in the right way, that are flexible, look at their culture of how they want to drive outcomes. What task do I want to achieve? Not what people do I need to achieve it. And we've seen this massively in government. So just very quickly to finish on this, there are a lot of government contracts and frameworks that are established to drive outcome-based engagements only. You may have heard of some of them. The key ones are things like G Cloud and digital outcomes and services and management consulting frameworks and technology services frameworks. And they are all prohibitive in that you cannot provide resource or contractors on an inside basis. And why is that? Well, because the end government organisation is procuring an outcome. So government has now matured to the point that they look at legitimate service and only procure legitimate service. And if government can get their house in order, albeit rather slowly, then private sector will catch up. So that's pretty much everything from myself. Hopefully that's been of interest. What we'll do now is, Dale, I think we'll open up to questions if there are any.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Really, really informative as always. So any questions, please do put them in the chat. The whole point of today is to kind of give you as much insight as possible. So do please feel free to add anything to the chat. While maybe you're thinking up one or two questions. One question from me, Stuart, is it's probably applicable to those who are already on the call today, is what are the common concerns that you're finding with the people that you're speaking to? I know you've touched on a few things there, but what are you seeing when you're speaking to people? You've kind of touched on a scaremongering, you've touched on the kind of wide scale, almost knee-jerk reactions.
Well, the biggest concern seems to be from and this goes up in the bigger the organisation, the more this is apparent, is that we just can't be open to any risk, right? And engaging with a contractor who's outside is just risk. And from a tax perspective, that could be considered possibly true. But from a overall success risk criteria, it is absolutely not true. We've seen already there is a shift in the market, shift in contractors who are going to just simply vote with their feet and walk away from opportunities to not provide legitimate service. And those organisations that don't shift are going to be left behind. So the biggest concern I end up coming in is advising and educating people, well, inside is good and outside is good. It's what's fit for purpose. But don't be scared about going and making a decision that you want to engage on an outside basis or you want to engage on a service basis, if that's what's right for your business. What you've got to define is what is right for your business, and be aware of the relevant risks. And I would say that the rewards, I am slightly biased, you can probably tell, but I am biased towards outside and service-driven engagements because it genuinely provides more opportunity and options than inside working or inside contractors do. There are obviously roles that are only suitable for inside, but I would say 60-70% will be outside. And if people can get over that cultural change, get over that almost that change of working, change of engagement, then they're going to see massive benefits. And we have seen some organisations, and I don't want to name them, but we've seen big private sector organisations that have done really good work in changing their cultures. And these are huge organisations. These are FTSE 100 organisations that are fundamental, and they are reaping the benefits now because they're getting the best skills, the best providers coming to them, and they're getting the best outcomes now.
Yeah, I think by the nature of our industry as well, some people often see change as a negative, and there is that kind of risk averse feeling as well. And on that point, I guess to overcome those thoughts that some people on the line may be thinking, what mistakes have you seen people making that we should avoid? You kind of touched on the pseudo services.
Yeah.
And it's got to be very clear, it's black and white, but there are obviously some people who are trying to sell something that isn't entirely as it should be.
The biggest one I come across, and it's my biggest bugbear, is, and you know this, but I'll say it for the audience, is statement of work is not a magic bullet for IR35. And anybody who says that, well, they need shooting really. But it's not, the contract is almost secondary to what is being executed, the work in practice. The reason why statement of work is beneficial is because it allows us to enforce certain behaviours and hold people accountable. Now, what I have seen and heard a lot in the industry and have come across, and it's not just in recruitment, it's in the industry generally, is the misuse of SOWs previously for procurement bypass and those things. And, opportunity is opportunity. But that's now what's coming back to bite us, is where there's been this misclassification and misusage of service-driven contracts. we're now having to almost over educate to get people back on the right page of, no, this is how a service contract works, and these are the benefits, and this is how you engage, and this is what you need to consider. And if people are going to continue using statements of work to do pseudo contracts, we can't stop that. All we can advise is best practice, but it will hold the end party liable, unfortunately. So that's why we need to look at the proper process.
That's good to know, and that's exactly obviously why we're talking to you as the expert, because it is about best practice and providing clients with the best advice. And as you've said before, it's giving people a choice, ultimately, a choice that maybe they didn't realise they had before. We've got a question from Scott, and his question in the chat is: with a turnover of less than 10.2 million and less than 50 employees, shift of determinations pushed back to PSC, do we as a business still need to provide PSC with a statement of work for the contract when the end client is a large corporate, or will a standard contract suffice?
So the answer to that is all of the above. It's ultimately your choice how you do that. Now, to be clear, if I understand the question, you've got an large end organisation that's clearly not small company exempt, and the intermediary is small company exempt, and then there's obviously the contractor. Well, the first point of reference here is the end hirer, the end party, is still responsible for determination, unless they are procuring a service, a legitimate service from the intermediary, the small company who is exempt. At that point, because the small company is then exempt, the determination would then flow down to the contractor. On that, then how you contract with the PSC is up to you. But just to be very clear, if your end client is procuring a service from you as the small company exempt intermediary, that will be a service contract. And you would most likely want to flow some of those terms or some of those deliverables down to your contractor. And so as such, you probably would want to use an SOW. Just for clarity. Do you have to? No, it would just be good practice.
Great. I hope that helps answer the question, Scott. But as I was going to say, any follow-up to this, we'll be more than happy to pick up offline and go into more detail. I think that is, oh, hold on. I was just about to wrap up, but we've got a question from Neil, so we're warming up here. Neil's question is: what is your advice on the best way to ensure working practices are able to give an outside IR35 decision, please? I've seen some questionnaires which then give an in or out opinion. Are they useful, or is there another way?
Yeah, so the questionnaires are just trying to gauge how you operate, how you as an individual, I'm assuming this person's the contractor, by the way, how they are engaging up through the supply channel. Equally, there should be a questionnaire that goes to the end hirer, the end procurer, on how they engage with their supply channel. The best way to try and assess working practice is, and this is not really like a defined metric, but it's that gut test. Or they call it the sniff test. If you fundamentally look and feel like you're being controlled, you're being managed, and you're being restricted on how you operate or how you work, and this is not so much as, well, you must work certain hours, but how you deliver the work and the order you deliver the work, and how that work is assessed and all those sorts of things. And that's likely going to be the working practices you are inside. And that's the easiest way to assess it, is, do I genuinely have independence or freedom to operate? And the easiest example is, I give is the building a house. If you've been asked to just build a house, here's a design, build the house. I don't care how you build it. I don't care if you start from top to bottom, which of course is impossible, but I don't care how you do it, but just get me that house and I'm going to pay you accordingly. The inside correlation of that would be, I want a house, I want you to lay the bricks in this order, and I want this many bricks on this day, and I'm going to inspect the quality of those bricks, and I'm going to choose the bricks, and so on. And I know that's a bit of a poor analogy, but it's the easiest I can give. Then you would clearly be able to assess, I don't have any freedom. I couldn't substitute myself because I'm the bricklayer or I'm the developer. And so it's assessing it on that overall perspective. Do I really have freedom? Do I have independence? Can I operate and deliver against that outcome? And how I get to that outcome is ultimately up to me. Hopefully that helps.
Great, thank you. I hope that helps, Neil. Again, any follow-up required, do let me know as well. Any other questions before I wrap up? I'm conscious of time, and I know we kind of put 45 minutes or so aside. I don't think there is at the moment, which hopefully is a positive. Maybe all of their questions have been covered in the session, and I know from my side, working with you, Stuart, you've always been extremely informative, but also simplified things as well, because there is, I would agree, a lot of scaremongering, over-engineering of solutions, but also making sure that we are doing things the right way, which requires speaking to the experts, of which you are. So yeah, on behalf of myself and the whole team at Understanding Solutions, also for all of those who have joined us this morning, I'm sure you'd all agree it's been a really, really informative session. Hopefully it's been kind of helpful and just kind of, I guess, demonstrated the challenges, but also the huge opportunities that we all have if managed in the right way and with the right advice as well. So it's exactly why we have set up Understanding Solutions. As I said, we've not launched it officially yet, but we will be over the coming few months. But if you do have any questions offline, please do feel free to get in contact with me directly.